The announcement by Mr. Donald Trump, the US President, that the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Agreement should not come as a surprise. Mr. Trump had made this a major plank during his campaign, and the fact that he remains skeptical about the seriousness or the gravity of climate change as a global issue, and his constant advocacy that the United States is getting the equivalent of a bad deal. And most recently, he made this observation that he represents Pittsburgh and not Paris, is also a case of perhaps playing up to the gallery and addressing the domestic sentiment in the United States. Be that as it may, it should not come as a surprise, but I think now the world and India in particular have to agree on how to deal with this. There are three issues that come to mind. One is we are now looking at a world where the United States, despite the mantle of leadership that it had assumed for almost 70 years after the end of the Cold War, is now showing what you might call as a sense of perhaps abdication, which is what Donald Trump has done. And also, I think, the multipolar moment that the world had been speaking about, because till recently it seemed as if the US-led Western Alliance was providing certain benchmarks as far as global governance was concerned. I think climate change and the current US decision has now created an opportunity where there is a need, I think, for the other major powers to see how they will deal with a very serious global issue without the United States. And I think this is where India could play a very valuable role. And Prime Minister Modi's most recent visit to Europe and his meeting with the German Chancellor and the other European powers provides, I think, the equivalent of a template where now the world has to talk about commitment to the Paris Accord without the United States. And at some point, I think the European Union, India, China, and Japan need to sit down and decide on the way ahead, particularly in relation to the funding pledge that had been made by the United States for less developed countries. So this is the second issue. And the third to my mind is that India now needs to, I think, take stock of its own climate change commitments and decide how it is going to deal with its own policies without the United States being on board. Because at one level, it is the US in a global context. The second is India and the US in a bilateral context, because after all, Prime Minister Modi had brought India onto the Paris Accord largely because of certain commitments made by President Barack Obama at that time. The entire grid has changed. So I think India needs to also address what kind of policies it now needs to follow in the light of the fact that the United States is no longer part of the Paris climate